Hey everyone, so in this video we are going to see how I use the brush to paint the rest of the elephant, right? So I used a large brush to paint a pink flat wash on the trunk, and this is a very light pink that I'm actually using this large flat brush to actually help me to paint the first layer of pink before we move on to painting the other details and the second layer on top, right? So using that flat brush, I'm just using these quick strokes to make sure that this pink strokes are being spread out onto the trunk, and using my fingers also to wipe away some of the excess paint. So I'm just using this flat brush, which is very good for painting large surfaces. So we are using a smaller brush that will be a little bit harder because right now the trunk is covering a very large surface, and so you will need to have this large flat brush, which is a 2-inch Data Rowney flat brush. Right, so once it is a little bit dry, I'm just going to use this brush to help us with painting the details. Right, so just make sure that we have the top part dry, and then we are just going to make sure. So now it is still not that dry yet, and so I'm using this color pencil, this pink color pencil, to help me with some of the details at the top, and just using this white color pencil also to help me with some of the details, right? So the thing is, we need to make sure that the first layer is dry before we move on to painting the second layer. So while waiting for this trunk to dry, I'm using these color pencils to help me with adding some more details to the top part of the head of the elephant. Right, so having all these details is also very important because we want to have as many details as possible, and that will help us to be able to make sure that we have all these very nice and very wonderful kind of attractive details that will attract the viewer to actually look at the subject more closely. So using that color pencil, I'm just trying to make sure that we have everything in, and using this brush, I'm just trying to spread out the pink paint that we have on the elephant. Alright, so just waiting for this thing to dry. It's gonna take a little bit of time, and so I'm just trying to touch up on the rest of the areas first before we move on to the actual painting of the trunk. Right, so I'm actually working on the different area now. I use different grays to do the body, so we'll return to that trunk later, and we will use this darker gray to kind of do this right hand side of the body where we have this darker gray, and we can mix a little bit of dark blue as well. And so again, we need to leave out some of those white spaces, those white spots, those white details for us to paint the details later on. Right, so we have all these very nice things that are going on right now, and we're just trying to use that brush to help us with painting around those details. And again, we can see that those shapes that are actually made are of different sizes, and so we have all these different sizes and different kinds of shapes and tones, different kinds of sizes of all those details, all those white spots that you're seeing right now. They're actually making up the majority of the left hand side, to the left of the dark area that we just made. Right, so we can use a little bit of darker gray as compared to the lighter gray on top, and so we would need to have all these details in place before we actually move on to painting it further, right? And so we will have all these different kinds of grays and different kinds of pink, and all these things will help us to be able to paint it well with all these different kinds of details, and of course all these white spots which is very similar to what we did on the forehead, but again you see the density of spots are being concentrated on the left hand side. So we're just repeating the same process as we spread out all these different grays. So again, I'm using dark blues mixed with the grays. I'm using like browns mixed with the grays and light blues and dark blues. So all these different grays actually give rise to a very interesting and a very attractive kind of a skin tone for the elephant. And so it is important for us to make sure that we have all these warms and cool grays that will enhance the entire painting. Right, so we have all these things that are helping us to make sure that the skin tone of the elephant is in place, and then we will then move on to the painting of the trunk. Right, so right now we can see that the trunk is fully dry, and I used light gray spots after the first layer is dry. Right, so the main contrast and the main difference between this part of the trunk and the forehead and the rest of the elephant is that previously we used some gray tones to paint the surroundings and leaving white so that we can paint the spots pink, but now it is the opposite. So if you look closely, the trunk itself is pink and we are using gray spots to paint on top of it. So it's the direct opposite of what we did earlier, and when you observe this closely, it is very interesting because the technique that I'm using right now is directly opposite to what we did earlier, and this is how the skin is actually formed, which to me is very interesting because previously we have a gray background with pink spots, and now we have a pink background with gray spots. So it's the opposite. So again, we have all these spots, again using different tones, different sizes, and different kinds of densities and distributions. So all these differences again will help us to make all these patterns look very attractive and very nice to look at. Right, so again, we don't want it to be too even, so we don't want to have like an entire straight row of spots and then a second row and a third row, because that would be too neat and too uniform. Rather, we will want to spread out in a very random way, and so when we have all these random spots and random kind of sizes and random kinds of tones, lighter spots and darker spots at the same time, all these details will help us to be able to help the viewer to enjoy the painting more, because it is not too uniform. It attracts the viewer, and from an artistic point of view, it is very good and well designed. So we are just trying to make sure that we have all these spots and all these lines that are being added. So just repeating the same process as we proceed downwards to the trunk, where the spots actually get darker and stronger and more dense. And right now we are trying to repeat the same thing for the legs of the elephant. And then we have all these different kinds of grays, again darker gray and lighter grays, and all these dark grays and light grays are actually mixed with browns, and also lighter grays and mixed with light blues and dark blues. So all these things are actually helping us to be able to portray the skin of the elephant in a very attractive way. So I use dark lines to paint the patterns on the trunk. So right now we are moving on to the bottom part of the trunk right here, where the lines are actually changing into the spots are actually changing into lines, and so we would need to use the brush to help us with all these spots and all these lines and all these lines that are getting more and more closely packed together. They are more and more dense, and so using that brush, I'm actually trying to make sure we have all these lines that are very close together, and in between those lines we are adding more spots. And so having those spots are actually enhancing the entire trunk, where we don't want to have just a few patterns, but when we have more of those spots, as we can see here in the lower part of the trunk, that will really help us to enhance the whole design and the whole attractiveness of this trunk, because we have more details and that makes it look more interesting. And so we have these lines and we have all these spots, and again using grays, and we can use browns and grays. So we can mix browns, we can use light blues to be mixed with the gray, and so this will actually help us to have all these different grays when we do this part. Right, so it is a very interesting thing to be able to paint animals, and for example, painting this elephant is something that I enjoyed very much, because we have all these different techniques that I can use, and by observing closely this the skin, that actually helps me to be able to see how I can actually do it. And I realized that there's a lot of techniques that are involved, and also the elephant looks really majestic with the eyes and the trunk and the body and the skin tone of the body. That really is something that is very nice to paint, and also very nice to look at. Alright, so we are just darkening the right hand side of the trunk, and we have all these gray tones, and we have all these different lines and different spots, and all these different spots actually contribute to this texture of the trunk as well, because we see that the trunk is actually not exactly smooth, and so having these lines and these spots make it look a little bit bumpy and rougher, and that will add more interest to the viewer. So again, now we are using some darker lines, and all these dark lines and gray lines actually help us to be able to paint this trunk with all these contrasting tones and lines and so on and so forth. So that actually will help us to be able to use all these different techniques and principles and concepts, and when we apply this in our painting, that will really make it stand out. Right, so we are moving on towards the very bottom of the trunk, and so again we would need to use the brush and guide the paint so that the paint will fall within the pencil mark. We don't want it to go outside, otherwise it would not look neat. Alright, so we have all these lines again being drawn in, and we're now using this brush to help me with guiding all these lines and this shorter lines and longer lines as well. So now I'm using the brush to help me with painting the pink areas, the parts that we left white earlier. Again, filling this part with pink and light pink, all kinds of pinks, using the color pencil again to add in more details. And we are now moving on to painting the the front leg of the elephant using those brown and gray tones. So using the color pencil, kind of like added a little bit more hair that is coming out from the elephant trunk, and just trying to complete all those lines that make up the trunk right there. Alright, so using a lighter gray tone just above the toe of the front foot, and later on we'll look at how we can actually paint the toenails and how this toenails actually come about. Right, so right now I'm using a dry brush technique to paint the toenails. So again, we don't want the brush to be too wet, because that will make it like very uniform, and we need all this dry brush. So when we use dry brush, that actually adds on to the texture of the thing that we are painting, right? So we have this dry pink tones, we have this dry black strokes, and of course this can be combined, and all these different colors, when you combine them together, that will really help us to have all these different dry brush techniques and all these different kind of things that we can see on that toenail, and so we can pack all these different kinds of details within that toenail by using this dry brush technique rather than using the wet brush. So that is very important when we are actually, painting this kind of textural thing like a toenail or the skin, some parts of the skin, and dry walls and the ground and so on and so forth. So the dry brush technique is a very, very useful skill when it comes to doing all these different kinds of things. So I left white some of the areas, which I'm now filling up with a lighter color, and so within that toenail you can see that there is a darker kind of tone, and then we have pinkish tones, and we have these lighter tones, which I'm actually using the water to kind of like spread out everything. So we have all these different tones within that toenail, and it is just amazing that we can pack all these different kinds of textures and tones and techniques into that one little toenail of the elephant. Right, so you can see that in the previous toenails I also used some dark tones and light tones. So again, we do not want to use the same colors for the same object, because when we change the colors, that will add more interest to the thing itself. So we have some of the dark tones, some of the light tones, all packed within that one particular area. So again, using the brush, I'm trying to create all these different strokes for the skin, and then later on we will move on to painting of the rest of the thing. So just trying to finish up the trunk right there using that very light pink tone. I'm just trying to fill up the white areas, and just trying to make sure that this part is also lighter than the top part where there's pink, because this part right here is slightly different, right? So it is even lighter pink, and again we can darken it a little bit, but we can have all these subtly changing pinks within that trunk itself. So that will also add this very subtle difference to the trunk, which will also make a difference if you look at the painting very closely. Right, so these are some of the techniques that I used to paint all my paintings and all my subjects. Again, the most important thing is variation, because when we vary the colors, the tones, the strokes, the thicknesses, the sizes, the lengths, all these things will help us to achieve a lot of changing kind of situations and changing kind of techniques and rhythmic kind of movements, and the things that we observe when we actually see all these changing elements will give rise to a better art piece that is formed rather than having everything in a very uniform way. Right, so these are some of the very useful techniques that I would like to share, and we have all these color pencils that I use to do the final details. So again, using the black color pencil, I'm adding in some of the details and the light purple as well, and the light pink, and so on and so forth. So all these colors will help us to have even more details, and those details will help us to see that there are more textures on the trunk itself and also on the skin of the elephant, and that will really help us to be able to depict all these different things very, very nicely, with all these details that are being added on after we have done everything using the watercolor. So this watercolor pencil is again a very useful tool that can help us to add all these interesting details on top. Right, so we are almost coming to the end of this video, and these are some of the techniques that I would like to share with you guys. Hey everyone, it's KY Tom here. Thank you for watching my video. If you enjoyed my video, please hit the like button and comment down below. Do consider to subscribe to my channel for more art videos. Check out the links on the description below to find out more about my art, and I hope to see you in the next one.